It is now 2:15. Investigative journalist John Sweeney is the kind of man who revels in the thrill of chasing a difficult story. He's reported from conflict zones, sneaked into Zimbabwe when he was banned from entering, upset Donald Trump, not a difficult thing to do, it has to be said, and doorstepped Vladimir Putin while pretending to be a professor of mammothology. I know, you can't make some of this stuff up. He worked for The Observer as a foreign correspondent before joining the BBC to work on Newsnight and Panorama. He's since left the BBC and has now written an extraordinarily prescient and fascinating book called Killer in the Kremlin, which explores Vladimir Putin's career so far and the events leading up to the invasion of Ukraine. Oh, and he has spent much of the last 6 months reporting from Ukraine. John Sweeney, a very warm welcome to the show.
Hiya.
John, a number of dates, but an important date is September 1999. Tell us why that date is important in understanding the lengths, reportedly, with lots of evidence, Vladimir Putin is willing to go to.
So this is the moment when Vladimir Putin has been appointed acting prime minister by Boris Yeltsin, the outgoing president of Russia. And essentially now he looks like an insipid spy in a cheap suit. He's got no popularity. There's no previous history of he's a nobody. And then something very, very dark happens. The official narrative is that Chechen terrorists,
in inverted commas, yes.
Yeah, in inverted commas. You can't see the inverted commas, so
no.
I'm like, thanks for... I haven't been broadcasting properly for a bit. Anyway, they blow up Moscow and they blow up some towns in southern Russia.
These are residential buildings.
Yeah, they're apartment blocks. They're working class apartment blocks, and they make no sense as a terrorist thing because it's not a high profile target at all. And what becomes horribly apparent quite quickly is that this was, in fact, a black operation by the secret police, previously named the KGB, now the FSB, which Vladimir Putin headed before he became Yeltsin's prime minister. And there is a ton of evidence. There were two standout things which are absolutely the clock striking 13, as George Orwell wrote in 1984. The first is that there was a bomb that went off in Volgodonsk, and the speaker of the Russian parliament announced a bomb had gone off in Volgodonsk. This is a city in southern Russia. And the bomb did go off in Volgodonsk, but only 3 days later. How on earth did that man, how was he able to predict the future? And then the second thing, which was very weird, peculiar, was people were found leaving an enormous bomb in a block of a working class apartment block, 20 stories high. I've been there in Ryazan, a city about 100 miles from Moscow. And the people were caught in the act. The local residents saw them, got their car number, the local police arrested them, and they turned out to be FSB, and they said that this was an exercise. And it wasn't an exercise because the local police sent in the bomb squad. There was a local bomb squad, and the bomb squad found Hexagon, military explosive, inside the basement of the block of flats, and it had gone off in the middle of the night, as it was planned to do, like 5 o'clock in the morning. It could have killed 200 people sleeping in their beds. Now, you put all of that together, and also the very fact that that there were people, Chechen terrorists, who were effectively working for the Russians, and this is a black operation. So this is the moment from the get-go. And what happens is that Putin says he's the Chechen terrorists, and we're gonna strike them. We're gonna kill them in the bog, meaning slang for toilet. And he became enormously popular because instantly, he was making himself different from Yeltsin, who was drunk, who was almost senile at the very end. And here was this tough nationalist guy standing up for ordinary Russians. The whole thing was a dark lie from the get-go.
And then forward to July 2003, another key moment in trying to understand who Putin was, and the things he was willing to do.
So if my memory serves me, that is the moment where there is a great investigative journalist and an MP called Yuri Shakachikin.
Indeed.
And he's on the case of the Moscow apartment bombs. He's also looking into the theatre siege, 2002, which again looks like a black operation, a setup by the secret police to blame Chechen terrorists, but actually they were the people in charge. If you remember, something like more than 100 people were effectively gassed when the riot police went in, and before doing so, they put some kind of knockout gas, but the mixture was too powerful, and it killed hundreds of the hostages, and every single one of the terrorists was shot dead, was executed there and then. Again, if you're investigating what happened, you don't do that. Yuri Shakachikin was on the case, in particular of the apartment bombs, and then what happened was he drank some tea, and then his flesh started to peel off, his hair fell out, and he died. Everybody thought it was poison. His lover, Alyona, and we spoke to her, my brilliant Ukrainian journalist Jenny Klochko got to speak to Alyona, and Alyona went to the morgue to say one last farewell to Yuri, and she couldn't see him in the morgue. And she went, there was an old lady, like, it reminded her of her grandma, and she was sad to see a lady who looked like a grandma in the morgue. She went up to the morgue supervisor and said, "Yuri's not here." And he said, "Oh, yes, he is, he's over there." And it was the woman, it was the thing that looked like her grandma was actually her lover. That's how unrecognizable he was, because of the poisoning. And this is the moment when the poisonings really start to take off. So what's happening is, if you track it back really quite early on, there's a series of people who are dangerous to Vladimir Putin, and they get shot, or they fall out of buildings, or in this case, their skin falls off, their hair falls out, and they're poisoned. There was no proper investigation into Yuri's death, and people learned not to ask questions.
And this, of course, is 3 years before the murder of Alexander Litvinenko.
Yes. So there is a great, wonderful professor of physics, emeritus, retired, Professor Norman Dombey. By the way, I teased him. I'm always provocative. And I said, do you know anything about theoretical physics? And I said, well, a little bit. I've passed a few exams. And I said, when did you get your degree? He said, Oxford. I said, oh, they give them away there. And then Norman, slightly irritated by me, said, and I got my doctorate at Caltech, and my supervisor was Murray Gell-Mann, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the quark. So that's the quark. So
yeah.
That put me in my place. But Norman believes, and I think I agree with his logic because he is the Sherlock Holmes of theoretical physics, that the Russian secret state, they poisoned Litvinenko in 2006 with polonium-210. But Norman believes that they would not have done that the first time. They would have tested it out in Russia. And what he believes is there are 3 Russians that he suspects were also poisoned with polonium-210. One of them was Yuri Shakachikin. Another was a Chechen warrior who had the same symptoms, hair falling out, skin falling off, a very healthy man suddenly dying in a week or two, and a Russian gangster called Roman Sepov who knew the dark stuff. So Putin was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in the 90s, and what it was said was the mayor, Anatoly Sobchak, was the mayor by day, and Vladimir Putin was the mayor by night, meaning that Putin was working with organized crime gangs, in particular the Tambov crime gang, and Sepov had dirt to sell about Vladimir Putin's corruption from those days, and then suddenly his hair falls out, his skin falls off, he dies, and Norman Dombey believes that all 3 were, if you like, the Russian secret state testing the polonium-10 before they used it in London against Litvinenko.
You've described Vladimir Putin, John, as a war criminal, a serial killer, and a psychopath.
Other than that, I'm broadly positive.
Other than that, broadly positive. But let's focus on the negatives, shall we? And we might get to the positives before 3 o'clock. Highly unlikely because there aren't any, but we might try. We might have time for that. So looking at those 3 words, some people may argue that they're hyperbole, right? So that it undermines an argument to just throw around words like serial killer, war criminal, because they're used a lot, aren't they? And psychopath in drama and film, etc., etc. But let's break down each one of those words and look at the objective evidence that would suggest that he is all of those things. And let's start with serial killer, because it's interesting that Joe Biden, when asked whether he was a killer, said yes. And your contention was that actually that's wrong. He is a serial killer. Explain.
So if you look at the numbers of dead, and actually a German reporter asked me, how many people do you think he's killed? And I'll crank through the numbers. Let's start with the wars, the big numbers. He started a war in Chechnya, the Second Chechen War. The casus belli, the reason for the war, was the Moscow apartment bombs. Roughly 80,000 people were killed in that. In 2008, he starts a war against Georgia. Roughly, not that many, 100 or so people were killed in that. He also invades Ukraine in 2014. He also supports the butcher Assad in Syria, but let's leave that aside because he's not directly responsible for that war, although he's kept Assad in butchery. The war in Ukraine...
There's MH17 as well, of course.
There's MH17. That's a different category. That's not a war, but I'll go on to that. Right. But the war in Ukraine, there's roughly about 20,000 people are killed in the first part of the war. This is the invasion of the east of part of Donetsk and Lugansk counties and the seizing of Crimea. This current war, the one that started, or the full-scale invasion from mid-February, is something like maybe 40,000 Russian soldiers killed. We don't know for sure, but maybe 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers, and we don't know precisely, but maybe again 10, 15,000 Ukrainian civilians. We can't tell because some of the dead are still under Russian occupation. But if you top those numbers up, that's at least 150,000. Then we've got mass events, for example, the Moscow apartment bombs, 300 dead in those. The Moscow theatre siege, 150 dead. Beslan, 333. A lot of them kids. Again, there's strong evidence that this was a black operation by the FSB. 2014, MH17 is flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. The Russians, to further their kind of proxy war, they're fighting in eastern Ukraine, but essentially it's a Russian invasion. They're worried about the Ukrainian fighter jets knocking out their proxies, and what happens is that they send a big surface-to-air missile system called a Buk across to help their proxies defend themselves against the Ukrainian Air Force. What they think they're firing at is a Ukrainian fighter jet, but it's not. It's MH17. It's a passenger jet. 298 people are killed, and I went there for BBC Panorama, and I stood in the middle of nowhere in the cornfield in eastern Ukraine, surrounded by dead bodies and luggage and bits of plane and the engines and the wheels. And there's the stink of the kerosene and the stink of the dead. And the thing that gets me is they have these trunkies, those little suitcases that toddlers are wheeled along by their mums and dads. And even to this day, when I see somebody, a mum or a dad, wheeling their kid along on a trunkie at Gatwick or Stansted, I get flashbacks. And so, yeah, the guy's a serial killer. Full stop.
We will get into war criminal and psychopath, two other descriptions that you've given of Vladimir Putin after we have the news headlines. It's 2:30. Here's Stuart Clarkson. Guest is John Sweeney. His book is called Killer in the Kremlin, the explosive account of Putin's reign of terror. Before we went to the news, John explained why he believes, with objective fact to back him up, that Vladimir Putin is a serial killer. Now let's move on to the other two accusations you lay at his feet. One is that he's a war criminal, the other one a psychopath. Let's start with psychopath, because the war criminal aspect of what he is ongoing as we speak. Psychopath.
So, I'd like to thank the Church of Scientology here, because I don't know if you remember now, I did a panorama in 2007 where I lost my temper with the Church of Scientology. You were not there for the beginning of the interview. I was that nutter. Now they say that I'm a bigot, etc., a liar and a fantasist. I believe that they're a space alien cult. And the point is that in 2016, I was invited by the Ukrainian Psychiatric Association to go to Kyiv, and I became great friends with the president of the Psychiatric Association in Ukraine, Semyon Glusman. And he's a completely wonderful human being. He's very funny. He also was the first Soviet psychiatrist in 1971 to protest against the Soviet abuse of psychiatry. What they used to do was take perfectly sane political dissidents and call them mad and inject them with powerful psychiatric drugs as a kind of punishment. Semyon wrote a report condemning this abuse and spent 10 years in the Gulag for his courage. Down the track, Ukraine becomes free, leaves the Soviet Union, breaks up. Semyon is the eminent Ukrainian psychiatrist, and we're friends because of the Scientology connection. And I interview him just before the war, and he says he does not believe that Vladimir Putin is mad in the sense that he has hallucinations or hears voices. He believes that he's bad, like Hitler, said Semyon, but not like a madman. However, you can be rational and a psychopath, and I believe he is, in that his mindset is pathological. He has, and the KGB noted this at the very start of his career, but he has a lack of empathy for others of an extreme kind, and it's pitiless. And so, but there are other tales, and the other psychiatrist I spoke to do the research for the book is an American psychiatrist called Jim Fallon, who's professor of psychiatry at the University of California, and he's made a study of great dictators: Stalin, Mao, Hitler, Putin, and in common with nearly all of them, the exception is Pol Pot, but in common with nearly all of them is some catastrophic life event when they're very little, either some kind of sexual abuse or they were abandoned by their natural mother or father very, very early on. And this leads to some kind of psychopathy. Here are the tales for it. They lie so smoothly. You know, when I doorstepped Putin about MH17 in Siberia, pretending to be a professor of mammothology, I asked Putin about this. Now, let's remember, 298 people were killed in that jet, and 10 of them were British. As far as British terrorist events go, that was a big one. And I don't believe that the Russian state were made to pay properly a real price for what they did there. And they continue to deny it, although the evidence is overwhelming that this was a Russian missile. Overwhelming, compelling, damning, whatever adjective you want to have. So when I challenge Putin about this, he blames the Ukrainians. He sort of fences, there's a long answer in Russian. But he lies so smoothly, and Jim Fallon, the professor of psychiatry at the University of California, says this is classic psychopath stuff, that they lie so smoothly because they have no moral sense whatsoever. Another tick is fearless dominance, that Vladimir Putin is the most dangerous person in the room, so you back off. And the real problem, and one of the reasons why I wrote this book, Killer in the Kremlin, is deliberately to set out the evidence of this man's serial killings again and again and again, because Western leaders, democratic leaders are used to trading, are used to dealing, are used to compromising. And when you have somebody like Vladimir Putin, what you try and do is to try and minimize the damage, is to say, hey, okay, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt, back off, it's okay, it's okay. And the problem with that is that Putin will come for you.
Well, he's not playing by the same rules that you are.
Exactly. That's the thing. That's the critical thing. He's outside the box of normal democratic discourse. And so for the idea that the West should tell and put pressure on the Ukrainians to kind of negotiate an end to the special military operation, that's a dark fantasy. It's a fairy tale. It's nonsense.
But wasn't there a political opinion that it was better to deal with a effective psychopath than an irrational drunk, which is what they'd been dealing with Yeltsin?
Well, the irrational drunk was far less dangerous.
Clearly.
Far less dangerous than this guy. And I think the truth is that what they really, really liked was the Russian money. They liked the fact that Russia, Russian oligarchs sent their bastard spawn to Eton and Winchester and even Harrow. They liked the idea of them parking their enormous pots of money, stolen, in fact, from the Russian public, in the City of London. And the City of London provides this enormous and extremely effective and efficient fog machine, so nobody knows who owns what. Where is Vladimir Putin's dark gold? We don't know. And that's one of the services that the City of London supplies. So I think, yes, it kind of made sense, or in their logic, in people like Tony Blair, George W. Bush, then Gordon Brown, then David Cameron, Theresa May, and Boris Johnson, that until the full-scale invasion this February, that all of them kept on giving Vladimir Putin the benefit of the doubt, kept on doing things which looked effective, but in reality weren't. Because, yes, it was better to kind of compromise with him, but also it kept the Russian dark gold flowing into the City of London.
Also, as well, of course, the war on terror. This was extraordinarily beneficial for Vladimir Putin, was it not?
So, when I was at BBC Newsnight, I covered every single terrorist attack, both the ones by so-called Islamic States and the one by the far right, and it was grim. But the scale, the threat to our democracy is far greater from the Russian secret state, Russian fascism. Not only that, but also the threat to the health of our planet, because our addiction to oil and gas, whether it's supplied by the Russian Federation or Saudi Arabia, is dangerous to our planet. The reason why London was baking hot yesterday was because we burn too much carbon, in particular oil and gas. Now, this profits Vladimir Putin and the people in the City of London who look after Russian dark gold, but it doesn't profit us. It hurts us. And for far too long, our democratic leaders here in Europe, in the United States, have put up with this because it's kind of convenient and the money is good. But the money's bad and it's dangerous. It's not convenient.
Is the invasion of Ukraine, most recent invasion of Ukraine, a result of Vladimir Putin's linear attempts to expand Russian territory and influence? Or is it potentially a result of the fact that there's no one left to give him a sense of reality? He's got rid of everybody that would have said, this is not a good idea. This is a strategic mistake.
Yes, you're absolutely on the money there, Niall. What we've got is, I love King Lear, and I love the fool in King Lear, because he mocks the king. And there is no one in Vladimir Putin's circle who's alive, who can say, no, boss, don't do this, because it's bad and it's mad and it's wrong. There is nobody who argues with him. What he's got is a series of yes men. We saw them in the Russian National Security Council. There was one guy, Narishkin, who's the head of the SVR, which is Foreign Intelligence Service, a kind of successor agency to the KGB, kind of a bit like our version of MI6. And clearly something has happened before, and Putin's needling him. And Narishkin starts to stutter. And it, you may have seen it, but I write about it in the book, and I say it's like a Bond villain, where the Bond villain sort of reaches for the lever for the bridge over the Piranha tank, so that as the weak minion makes a terrible mistake, he walks across the Piranha bridge, and bang, he's in, and he's being eaten alive. And that's what it's like to be inside Putin's circle. There's no one arguing with him. That's what's so scary. By the way, all of this is a great argument for democracy. I mean, I'm passionate, partly because I've met and challenged Donald Trump, and he said, maybe you're a bit thick, John. But one of the terrible things that Putin has done is sown division. I think the evidence is strong that the Americans certainly think this, but the Russian secret state helped Donald Trump get elected in America, and I think the evidence is equally strong that Brexit was funded by dark Russian money. There's never been a proper investigation into that because it hasn't served the purposes of the governing party, the Conservatives at the moment, who are very much pro-Brexit, getting Brexit done, etc., etc. But what if this was a major goal of the Kremlin? Of course it was, because it helps divide Europe. It makes Europe a weaker thing. So Putin is a dark actor. Now, I think he's not mad, and that's what Semyon Glusman and Jim Fallon, two psychiatrists, both say. But I also feel, this is a kind of metaphor, but he's in a kind of dark room where his understanding of reality, his sense of reality, is really reduced because it's so gloomy. He's because of COVID, he's down the end of a very, very, very long decontamination tunnel. But also, those long tables. Remember that long table he met Macron with just before the war? I asked Semyon about that, and Semyon Glusman said, I said, what's with the long table? And Semyon said, it's a distance between him and his death. So this man is paranoid. He's horribly insecure because of something dark that happened when he was very young. He is pitiless, and he uses the tension, the natural tensions and arguments that we have inside our democracies against us. He's far more dangerous than so-called Islamic State.
Let's move on to war criminal. We started our conversation, John, with September 1999. What did Vladimir Putin unleash upon the Chechen people that should be a warning? And in fact, it's not a warning because we've seen it. I mean, if you look at Grozny and what happened to Grozny, it is comparable to what is being done in Ukraine.
Yeah. So I first called Vladimir Putin a war criminal in March 2000, and no one listened to me. And part of the reason why I've written this book, part of the reason why I'm kind of wrestling with life insurance policies right now, trying to find the right one, is because this isn't the war crimes which we've seen, and former BBC colleagues like Clive Murray and Jeremy Bowen have so brilliantly reported on, are not new. Like, if you think they're new, then you haven't been paying attention. Back in 2000, I saw evidence with my own eyes. I went undercover to Chechnya, and I saw evidence of fuel air bombs. These are banned against civilians, and the Russians had used them. A fuel air bomb essentially it's the first bomb explodes about 100 meters above ground and produces an enormous cloud of petroleum jelly, then it's ignited, and it has the effect of killing all the oxygen for, say, 500 meters. And it causes a vacuum which sucks people's lungs inside out, and people die of oxygen starvation. And this is why it's banned against civilians. And I saw powerful evidence of that being used against Chechen civilians. One man had lost 18 members of his family. He told us all about it. I was making a film. I was working for The Observer and Channel 4 Dispatches at that time. I also saw and interviewed an 8-year-old girl who'd been in a refugee convoy. The family were in a Volga car, and she was little, and she lay on the back window, and the Russians bombed the convoy. And the other 6, her mum and dad, her brothers and sisters and her cousin were all killed. The pressure from the bomb blew the back window out, and she was thrown into the mud. When I saw her in the hospital, her face was horribly burnt. But she survived. None of her family did, and something like 230 other people were killed. And that was an attack on a refugee column. And then I went to Borodanka after the Russian army left Kyiv, left the north of Ukraine. And to get to Borodanka, we saw car after car with Yeti. Yeti means children in Russian, which had been spray painted on these vehicles. And they'd been shot up by the Russian army, bullets in the windscreen. War crime after war crime after war crime. In Bucha, when the Russian army left, I got there in early April, and I went into a garden, and there were 2 civilians. One guy had been shot in the back of the head. The other guy had been shot in the front, a hole where his forehead should be. And it's probably one of the most obscene things I've ever seen. And that's war crime straight there. Civilians shot like that, executed. Normally in war you have damage. People are killed by artillery, shrapnel. And something like out of 10 people killed, 7 out of 10 are killed by shrapnel from artillery. In Bucha, 7 out of 10 people were killed by bullet wounds. It means they were executed. This man has a killing machine. The only way this war stops, is if we kill the killing machine and we stop him.
How can you stop someone? Or maybe you can now that you realise exactly who he is. Finally, after he invaded Ukraine in February, John, the world woke up to who Vladimir Putin actually is. Not that they didn't have plenty of evidence before, but it affected their economies then. And perhaps that was one of the reasons they took more interest. But is just shipping more and more weapons to the Ukrainians enough to defeat his killing machine?
Yes. So what's happened? I was last there in at the end of June, and I've got this Patreon thing, so people sort of follow me, and I write pieces for them, and then a couple of days later I stick it up so everybody can read it. But the piece I wrote is called Metal Fatigue, and one of my friends, the guy who arrested me on day 2 of the war because he thought I was a Russian spy. Do I look like a Russian spy? Anyway, he's now an officer, a lieutenant in the Ukrainian volunteer force, but he's part of the Ukrainian army, and he's lost 20 friends. So there's a real feeling that the Russian army meat grinder was killing the very best of Ukraine. But what's happened since then is that finally the Americans have the American long guns have turned up. They're called HIMARS, rocket artillery, and basically they've got a punch of 40 miles. Russian artillery is good for 15 miles. So in simple boxing, what the Ukrainians have now got, the HIMARS system, enables them to have a much longer reach than the Russians, and they have used that to knock out 12 major ammo dumps. The Russian logistical system is bad. What they're doing is they're putting all their shells in trains and then taking them to what's like an enormous kind of B&Q warehouse, and they're putting all of the shells in the warehouse, and then they're taken by lorries to the front where they hammer the Ukrainian front lines. Since last week, that's kind of stopped because the Ukrainians have used the long guns, the HIMARS system, to blow up 12 massive Russian ammo dumps. So that's had an absolutely clear effect on the war. What we expect to happen is later this summer, in the autumn, there will be a counter-offensive. I believe that the Ukrainians will win. Their spirit is extraordinarily strong. To hang out in Kyiv, as I did from before the war for 2.5 months until the Russian army left Kyiv, was, yes, there were times when it was incredibly sad and depressing and frightening, but it was also extraordinarily moving and powerful, and I felt honoured to be there and honoured to tell their story because their fighting spirit is so strong. It's simple. They're defending their homes. There is no good explanation for what the Russians are doing.
No. And also as well, a mistake that the Russians made previously in Afghanistan as well, is that they have nowhere else to go.
Yes, that's exactly right, Niall. It's you fight when you've got nowhere else to go. And the Ukrainians are teaching us a very simple lesson which we've forgotten in our comfort, in our love for Love Island and all the rest of it. What we've forgotten is that democracy must be defended, and free speech does not come free.
And it's fragile, John.
Yes.
That's what people don't seem to understand, how fragile democracy is.
Yes, yes. It needs to be protected and nourished and defended. And right now we're having this conversation because of our service people in the Army, in the Royal Navy, in the RAF are looking after us. And right at the front line, it's the Ukrainian army. I couldn't have said what I said about Vladimir Putin. I couldn't have written this book in Kyiv about Vladimir Putin without people like my friend Vlad Demchenko and the rest of the Ukrainian army defending my free speech, defending my freedoms with their own lives. We've got to help these people, because if we don't, the Chinese are watching. If Vladimir Putin gets some kind of victory out of this or some kind of stalemate he can colorize as a victory, then the Chinese Communist Party will say, okay, let's go take Taiwan, as we've taken Hong Kong, as we've destroyed Tibet, as we're crushing freedom in Xinjiang. Let's do that. And so this is this is an incredibly important battle. It feels like 1939. Being in Kyiv in this year felt like what I read about being in London in 1940, where these good people, all they want to do is drink beer and go dancing, but they've got to fight the monster next door. That's what London and Britain did in 1940. That's what the Ukrainians are doing right now against Vladimir Putin.
We've got just about a minute left. A number of people are tweeting me about how fascinating and equally terrifying they're finding our conversation this afternoon, and it should be both of those things. Why do you stick with this? Why are you obsessed with telling the world about just how bad this man is in 50 seconds?
I'm thinking about my Russian friends who stuck it to Vladimir Putin, Anna Politkovskaya, Natasha Esmerova, Boris Nemtsov. Poisoned, then shot. I'm thinking about a man I admire, I like to call my friend, I've met him twice, Alexei Navalny, poisoned, now in jail. This is the best of Russia. These people should have been the future of Russia, and Vladimir Putin has either had them snuffed out or locked up. But there is enough of Russia, and I believe in it. I did Russian at school. I feel passionately about that. I also feel passionately about my Ukrainian friends who are fighting for my freedom, our freedom right now. They're extraordinary, ordinary people, and they're incredibly brave. And we need to do better. We need to stand by them. We need to help them. We need to do better by them.
John Sweeney, thank you very much indeed for coming on the show today to talk about this extraordinary book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Killer in the Kremlin, the explosive account of Putin's reign of terror.